Alright guys, it's time for part 3 of why this response to C-19 is not capitalism. And for this particular response, it's going to be about what I'm hearing from the progressive types, from the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders, and the Representative Omar, who kind of comes off as like the runt that lags behind the progressive leadership and just kind of parrots. I don't think I've ever heard an original idea from Representative Omar that hasn't already been parroted by Bernie Sanders or AOC, and obviously the only competition Representative Omar would have in just parroting progressive talking points would be Elizabeth Warren. But then again, I think Representative Omar probably actually believes these things, whereas I think Elizabeth Warren is an opportunist. But anyways, the things that they're saying is, how come no one asks how we're going to pay for this in response to the stimulus and the Fed printing? How come nobody asks how we're going to pay for this? And they'll say, and this has been their thing for a while, that, we always have money for military, we always have money for this or that, but yet we never have money for, insert progressive program X here, whether it's UBI or Medicare for all or, canceling student debt or making college tuition free, etc., etc. Insert your plan here. How come we have money for this and not for that? And more specifically, how come nobody asks where the money comes from? Well, obviously in the circles that I'm in, which is the libertarian, anarcho-capitalist sort of that realm, that sphere, we always ask where this money's going to come from. And we ask where the money's going to come from not because we don't know. We know the Fed's going to print it because we know, just Austrian economics 101, just economics really 101, is how government gets money. Government gets its money either through stealing it from the people or from printing it. As I said, I think in part 1 of these responses. So that's how the government gets the money. Now, when it comes down to why is no one asking where the money is going to come from? Now, if you're a conservative, perhaps you don't have some sort of like a guiding principle. I know it sounds sort of pretentious of me to constantly talk about principle, but the reason I am a libertarian is because I think these are the most consistent principles that you can approach these situations with. I don't think any other group they have general guidelines that they operate on, but I don't think there's any sort of underlying principle in the sense of almost like in science, you have like a law that states why something happens this way. I just find libertarianism to have the most consistent principle, and principles, but it's not always the most convenient of principles. There's plenty of times where I sit there and stop and like, man, how can this work in this situation? And this is a good example of it. How come nobody asks where the money is for this? We see what the problem is. Like I said, the government only can get money from two ways. One is to steal it directly from people through taxation, usually. I guess tariffs would fall under that, but tariffs really are just taxation. And printing. We have a central bank. The Federal Reserve is printing that money. And the problem is, nobody asks where it comes from. What a better way to phrase that question would be, is this affordable? And the reality is no, because if you break those economic laws, again, like I mentioned in the previous parts to this, when you break an economic law, you suffer a consequence. The piper has to be paid, is what the old saying is. And when you print that money, it inflates the dollar. The dollar loses purchasing power. So the issue to all this is not, oh, well, since we're able to do this, we should be able to do all these other things. The problem is that we did this. You see, like, the idea that two wrongs make a right is just not correct. I mean, this is stuff that you learn as a child, but then again, you learn a lot of this stuff as a child. You learn don't hit people, don't take their things. You learn that as a child. But for some reason, as an adult, we get rid of that notion. But to this particular topic, that just because we did all this spending in one thing, and by the way, I think you can argue under the basis of the current situation where if the government did shut these businesses down and all these people went unemployed because of those government actions, you could make an argument, at least under this current system, that the people are owed some sort of I don't know what other word you would use other than a reparation for the fact that the government is directly the reason that they're out of work and they're unemployed. So the government giving them some money, now it doesn't mean that the money still comes from somewhere. Obviously, the money in this case is coming through inflation because there's no way they could tax you enough to pay for most of the shit that they end up paying for, which kind of raises another question, or another problem, I guess you could say, because if this is the case and we can do this right now, if this is affordable, if there's not some repercussion for us printing money and spending the way that we're doing, especially at the rate that we're doing, I think we're looking at over $3.5 trillion deficit we're looking at for this year. So far, we're not even halfway into the year yet. Who knows where this is going to end up? But if we could all just stay at home and not go to work, not produce things for the society that we're living in, and we could just live off of Fed dollars, freshly printed money, or money sent directly digitally into your bank accounts or whatever. If we could sustain that system, the question would then be, why the hell don't we do that all the time? Why are we doing it now? And if it's okay now, if it's sustainable now, and if there's not repercussions for it now, why is there ever repercussions for it? Why does there ever have to be a time when people have to go back to work? Is this level of unemployment and staying at home and all this, why is that not sustainable? In fact, even worse than that, if we could just live off of Fed dollars and the government can spend as much as it spends and it's no problem when we rack up the debt, if there's no problem in having a $24+ trillion debt, there's no problem in printing all that money and spending the money the way that we do, why the hell do we pay taxes in the first place? What's the purpose of taxes if government can just print its own money? Well, the reality is because there's repercussions of this. And the repercussions of this are going to be horrible whenever the inflation hits. And the question then is, if the Fed can manage to reinflate the bubble again, like it did in 2008, it'll drift on for a while. But again, it'll just be kicking the can down the road. Now, whether or not when that bubble pops, if that's going to be the complete collapse of the dollar, I'm not entirely convinced that we can make it to another one. But let's say you did make it to another one. There's only so far you can go. Eventually that bubble is going to pop. Now when it pops, who knows? Who knows exactly when it's going to pop, but it is going to pop. But I'll guarantee you what, until that bubble does pop, if we manage to kick this recession a little further, when the bubble bursts, it's going to be that much worse every time we're able to reinflate the bubble. And not only that, the inflation is undeniable. The inflation's happening anyways, but the inflation happening at this kind of a rate is a great reason to get in. For me, I started doing it last year, getting into precious metals, getting into gold and silver. Obviously, I think everybody wishes they could, everybody who does this, everybody who stacks silver or gold wishes that they could afford, especially more gold. But gold has gone up from, I think just this year has gone up from about 12 or 1300 to right now it's over 1700. And the worse the inflation gets, the higher it's going to be. Like for the history of gold, like in 1970, gold was $35 an ounce. 1971, Richard Nixon takes us off the gold standard. By the year 2000, gold had shot up to $300 an ounce. Now $300 an ounce then by 2011, it was $1,900 an ounce. And it's been floating in 1900 to about 1200. It's been floating in there since the peak of the last recession. Now, where is gold going to be in the future? Well, you might could argue whether gold's going to be 3,000, 5,000, maybe, whatever it's going to be. I'll tell you this much: it's going to be worth a hell of a lot more than your dollar is going to be worth. And the same, I would say, goes for silver. Silver's, historically, when you just look at the trends and the records and everything like that, it's a pretty good hedge against inflation. Obviously, gold, in my opinion, is the best hedge against inflation. But that's what's going to happen with the future of the dollar. That's something that I'm concerned about. So to that particular response, how come nobody asked where the money comes from for this? Two wrongs don't make a right. Just because we spent the money here, and at least here you could argue, I guess on some level you could argue, that this is because you have a pandemic going around. Every country in the world is getting hit by this thing. You could at least make that sort of an argument. And for the Trump bucks that you're getting, like $1,200 plus $500 for every kid, et cetera, et cetera, you could at least argue in that scenario that it's temporary and it's not permanent. It's not going to be long lasting. That obviously is going to have less of an impact, like a one-time $1,200 for the adults, plus the $500 for kids and stuff. And they're probably going to end up doing a couple of more of these. But that obviously is less of a financial drain on the system than, for instance, an Andrew Yang $1,000 a month, or them saying for the duration of this $2,000 a month. But the thing is, the damage is already done. And the damage is going to be even worse because I don't see any way that economically you get back to I guess, what was the normal. The normal where it was, we were already getting screwed over through taxes. The Fed was already printing. But where you get back to some sort of normal where the UBI, or the Trump bucks in this case, is cut back down to nothing. Now, I think eventually that will probably happen. But I think once the people have got a taste for it, the people are going to want more of it. So I honestly wouldn't be surprised. I don't know if Donald Trump will win this next election. Now, obviously, he's got a recession going against him, and normally a president doesn't win during a recession. Then again, if he can spin and I guess convince enough of his base and enough of the Rust Belt and enough of the kind of middle-of-the-road voters, the moderates, if he can convince them that it's not his fault and it's the fault of the virus, which, obviously the virus isn't his fault, but Trump was just another in the long line of horrible Fed policy. Trump was right whenever he campaigned on a lot of this stuff. Trump was right about the numbers being bullshit. He was right about the economy being a bubble. He was right about plenty of that, but then as soon as he got elected, he was like, oh, look at me, my economy is the greatest numbers ever. It's bullshit. He was just absolutely more of the same. Complete sellout. Completely sold out everything that he ran on in regards to the economy, in regards to what would be the better Fed policy. That's why there's always a tweet. Because as soon as he got in, he ended up doing the exact same thing. So whether or not he's going to win, I don't know. But I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Trump did win, that Trump would probably have some pressure put on him to keep some kind of like and essentially, even if it's temporary, a UBI. I mean, he's already done the Trump bucks. He supported that, the $1,200. I wouldn't be surprised if the longer this goes, the more money he dishes out. And honestly, I was listening to Dave Smith and Jimmy Dore have a conversation. And I think Jimmy Dore actually made a really good point about how Donald Trump could be the president that ends up getting, even if it is temporary or whatever, some sort of Medicare for all. I really wouldn't be surprised because you got to remember, the higher unemployment gets, they're talking 25, 30% unemployment, which is depression level unemployment, in a country where we have this retarded system where your health care is tied to your employment. Now, I'm not a fan of Medicare for all. I don't want the government anywhere near healthcare, but I want a free market system. But healthcare being tied to your employment is insane. It's incredibly stupid, especially in a situation like this. And enough people are going to be hurt by this, and enough people that are Trump supporters are going to be hurt enough by this. And I think once people get a taste for it, it's probably here to stay. So, to the initial response again, nobody asks where the money comes from. I do ask where the money comes from, even though I know where the money comes from. I think everybody should care where the money comes from because there isn't the free lunch and we all have to pay for this.